my slides?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. That was a very difficult talk to follow. That was really interesting. But hi, my name's Kelsea Best. I'm a PhD candidate in Earth and Environmental Sciences at Vanderbilt University. And I'll be talking about a couple years worth of work using machine learning combined with agent-based modeling to study environmental migration in Bangladesh. So pulling this way down to a much more specific case than what we heard previously. All right, so quick overview. I'm going to be covering quite a few different methods and covering them quickly. But the main idea of this talk is that when we're dealing with really complex socioeconomic challenges like environmental migration, then using multiple methods in combination can be a really powerful approach. So to get us started, the question I'm really interested in and all of my dissertation work has been looking at is the question of environmental migration. So any kind of human migration where environmental change, including potentially climate change impacts, might influence that decision to migrate. And it's important to note that the decision to migrate is notoriously complex. As I'm sure anyone here who has moved before can imagine, there's a lot that goes into that decision to migrate or to stay. There's personal preferences, risk tolerance, and then larger dynamics such as economic opportunities, social norms, political circumstances. So in this complex context, environmental change is really only one of many influences on that decision. And environmental change can also act to impact those other dynamics as well. So the moral here is that it's very complicated. And the case study that I'm using is that of a southwestern coastal Bangladesh. And this is a really fascinating place to study environmental migration because the natural system itself is very dynamic and complex. There's a constant erosion and accretion of the land. There's high climate vulnerability, especially to cyclones, sea level rise, and salinity encroachment. And then on the human side of things, it's a very densely populated country with a population of more than 160 million people. And mobility is a really common way of life there, even without environmental stress, especially rural to urban migration for livelihood opportunities. So all of these things come together to make this a really interesting coupled human natural system to study. So as we all know and has come up multiple times, complex challenges require complex solutions. So when we're thinking about these complex systems, we really need a transdisciplinary approach. And I'll argue that includes multiple methods and transdisciplinary methods applied. So I work with a team from Vanderbilt and a couple other universities, including local universities in Bangladesh, that's been working in this context for decades. And I've just been working there the past 5 years or so. And I'm very lucky to be working with a highly transdisciplinary team. So we have people in the natural and physical sciences, we have political scientists, environmental psychologists, and myself and my advisor, Jonathan Gilligan, are really on the computational modeling side of things. And our goal is to try to pull these disciplines together and integrate the different data that we're getting from our various colleagues. So I was very fortunate to come into my work on this project with access to this very rich data set of household surveys from the southwestern region of Bangladesh, as you can see on this figure. So in 2013 and 2014, two of my collaborators, Catherine Donato and Amanda Carrico, collected these household surveys and migration histories from 9 different communities in the region. And this survey included pages and pages of questions with everything from migration trips and motivations for migration to questions of water availability, experience with various extreme weather events such as cyclones, household conditions, etc. So the final data set that I was able to work with was more than 1,600 households and approximately 2,000 different variables. So for social data, this was quite a large data set. As I began this work, I was really wondering if we even have a sense of what questions or variables in that data might be most important for thinking about migration. So I used a machine learning approach called random forest algorithm to simply predict the number of migrations per household that we had in that survey data. The random forest also allowed me to look at the rank variable importance of those 2,000 variables, and we see the top 15 here. So what this tells me is that things like latitude and longitude, even when controlling for the community itself, are very important. Experience with cyclones, and then a couple important variables that seem to indicate economic status, such as owning a business, owning a gas or kerosene cooker or a refrigerator. So these results kind of tell me what is important in the data for migration, but they don't tell me how those variables are impacting the migration output. So my next step was using a hazards model, so a different kind of modeling approach with the top 15 identified important variables to begin to get a sense of directionality in terms of how those variables are important for migration. So what I found here is kind of confirming what we suspected, which is that higher economic status seems to increase migration, whereas poorer households are less likely to migrate, again, from the data that we collected in this specific region. Okay, I'm gonna chug along. So then I took all these insights from these different analyses and sought out to create my own agent-based model of migration. So what we know is, again, migration in this region is largely driven by the ability to earn a living, so economic motivation. And migration also costs money. So it's possible that some of the poorer households in these regions are less likely to move. So for my agent-based model, I used what's called a pattern-based approach. So I identified two key patterns from the literature from Gray and Muller that I wanted to see if my model could reproduce qualitatively. These two patterns are, first, at a community level. Gray and Muller found that when a natural hazard such as a drought impacts a community, there's this nonlinear response in terms of outmigration. So initially, if only a few households are impacted, there's a decline in overall rates of migration. And then above a threshold of about 20% of the community being impacted, there's an increase in migration again. And then at the household level, the second pattern I was interested in is that Gray and Muller found that households that were not directly affected by the natural disaster were more likely to move than those that were directly impacted. So I created my own agent-based model using Python and an object-oriented approach. My model has agents for individuals who are primarily seeking livelihood opportunities. The individuals form households, and the individuals and households exist within a stylized community. So at the community level, an environmental shock representing a drought may happen at each time step of the model. And then at the household level, those households are deciding whether or not to send a migrant as a response to that environmental event. The initial model used a economic utility maximization approach for decision-making, but it is flexible, and I'm currently incorporating more behavioral psychology, including the theory of planned behavior, into that decision-making. So here's a schematic of that model structure, and this is where I really wanted to highlight that the model is very flexible and does allow the easy inclusion of different kinds of decision-making, making it a really useful test bed for trying to test how these decisions might be being made. So then I went back to machine learning using output from my agent-based model, and I used the machine learning to calibrate the model. So I had two uncertain parameters in my initial model, the cost of migration and then the benefit or utility of migration. So I used a Latin hypercube sampling approach to sample across a wide parameter space of those two parameters and ran the model 150 times for each of those combinations, which is a point on these figures. And then I could evaluate if that specific parameter combination was able to reproduce our patterns of interest. And I'll speed up a little bit, but what we found is that initially the economic model was not doing a good job of reproducing our patterns. We went back, used our empirical knowledge to change our land distribution within the model, and we started to actually see really good matching to both of our patterns. We see here, and I'm happy to take questions about this, is that actually the distribution of land ownership, specifically inequality in who owns what amount of land, was really important for our ability to reproduce those patterns. So we saw higher levels of inequality within the community yielded much higher rates of success in reproducing the patterns that we saw from the empirical literature. So this is a kind of non-trivial, unexpected result that community inequality really matters when we're thinking about migration patterns. So the key points are machine learning can help us calibrate our agent-based models and also inform what goes into the agent-based models. The pattern-oriented approach, I think, is powerful, again, for evaluating the model and calibrating it. The model is flexible to allow us to test different decision-making, and it's this kind of approach of multiple methods has led us to the insight of inequality and economic opportunity being really important within the origin community for rates of out-migration. I just want to very briefly, and I don't have time to really get into this, but I'm also interested in incorporating storytelling and narrative and thinking about how we can bring stories into our model development as well. So this is a side project I've been working on with just collecting narratives from environmental migrants in Dhaka, and hoping to use some more participatory methods going forward. So with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators, and I'll leave my contact information up here. I would love to talk more about this or hear from anyone. Thank you.